Hello, and welcome to the second in a series of talks to celebrate the publication by Hoover Press of Fanning the Flames, Propaganda in Modern Japan, edited by Dr. Kei Ueda, curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection, and featuring essays by a number of distinguished scholars, one of whom is here with us today. I'm Eric Wakin, the Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution and Director of its world-renowned library and archives. The book, Fanning the Flames, and the exhibit bring together scholarly essays and archival material from the from the Hoover Institution Library and Archives, and detail the role of Japanese propaganda in fostering national identity and mobilizing participation in the country's transformation and wartime activities, beginning with the First Sino-Japanese War and continuing to the end of World War II. Allow me to take a moment to thank my colleagues, including Dr. Ueda, Samira Bazorgi, Marissa Ree, Maya Abe, Kira Peacock, and many others at the Library and Archives. I'd also like to thank Barbara Ariano and her colleagues at the Hoover Press to help us get the book out. And finally, of course, the community of Hoover overseers and other supporters of the institution, without whom nothing we do would be possible. Today's talk is titled War Fever as Fueled by the Media and Popular Culture, the path taken by Meiji Japan's policies of enrich the country and strengthen the armed forces. Our speaker is Professor Toshihiko Kishi, professor at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. And our moderator is our very own Dr. Kei Ueda. Please allow me to briefly introduce Dr. Ueda, and then we'll get started. Kei Ueda is the curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. She has curated many of the materials used in this volume and in the accompanying exhibition, Fanning the Flames. Dr. Ueda manages the Japanese Diaspora Initiative, endowed by an anonymous gift to promote the study of overseas Japanese history during the Empire of Japan period. In addition to her traditional curatorial work, Dr. Ueda curates and develops the Hoji Shimbun Digital Collection, the world's largest online, full-text, open access, free digital collection of pre-World War II overseas Japanese newspapers. The order of today's activities will be as follows. Dr. Ueda will introduce Professor Kishi, and we'll hear the talk, and then she will moderate questions after the talk. Please welcome Dr. Ueda.
Thank you, Eric, for opening the event. Good afternoon. We are delighted to have Professor Kishi as our guest speaker today. Professor Kishi contributed 2 chapters to the publication, Fanning the Flames, one on the First Sino-Japanese War and the second on the Russo-Japanese War. It's rare for Japan-based historians to write for an English-speaking readership, and it's even rarer for them to speak to an English-speaking audience. So we are very, very grateful for Professor Kishi's extraordinary commitment to disseminate the research results globally and contribute to the international discourse. Before I introduce Professor Kishi, I'd like to briefly mention our recent activities on Japanese propaganda. The book, an edited exhibit companion publication, Fanning the Flames, was just launched on June 1st. It's a colorfully illustrated book with a wide range of Hoover collections. Looking back, this project was not easy to complete during the pandemic, as you can imagine. I don't have the time to name every individual of the Hoover Library and Archives who helped us, but I'm very, very proud of our team efforts during this challenging time. This publication is unique and ambitious in covering multiple types of Japanese media from the First Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1894, through World War II. This approach provided us with a tool to study both the continuity and changes over time. We are very fortunate to have 10 scholars of high expertise in their fields of the histories of Japan, East Asia, media, intelligence, and art contribute 9 chapters covering a fascinating array of topics. Their research reveals the interactive process of propaganda, which worked both top-down from the authorities and bottom-up from the grassroots and profit-oriented businesses. We primarily feature 2 collections at Hoover. One is multicolored prints known as Nishikiri, made from a Japanese woodblock printing technique of battles and political scenes. The second set is kamishibai, or paper plays of World War II home front propaganda media targeting children and women in the Empire of Japan. We also offer a glimpse into the worldwide propaganda war by sharing some of Hoover's rich multinational archival library collections. The publication and speaker series are followed by physical and online exhibits at Hoover, which will enable researchers and visitors to interact and engage with collection in new ways. Among the many components of the online exhibit will feature our collaborative project with Professor Kishi and Kyoto University. Our exhibit team is now giving you a sneak preview. Kyoto University's tremendous collection, Asia Depicted on Postcards, helped us create a virtual experience as a tourist to Port Arthur, visiting war monuments and battle sites from the Russo-Japanese War. This is one of the most compelling examples to show how Japanese propaganda was commercialized and spread to the grassroots. And thank you for submitting many questions in advance. If you have any additional questions, please submit them in the Q&A function. We try to answer as many questions as possible. Now, let me finally introduce Professor Kishi. Toshihiko Kishi is a professor at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Kyoto University. His research covers 20th century Asian history, East Asian regional and media studies. He has published extensively on East Asian history and is the author of Visual Media in Manchuria, Posters, Postcards, and Stamps, East Asian Popular Songs Hour, Crossing Boundaries, and Crossing Musicians. He's also is the co-editor of Enlightening Through TV, USCAR Public Diplomacy 1950 to 1972, and Picturing Taiwan, the Asahi Shimbun Press Photo Selections, and many other books. He's also a member of the Science Council of Japan and a senior researcher at the Research Center for Science Systems, Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Now let's welcome Professor Kishi.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Kishi from Kyoto University. My research is focused on the history of East Asia. I want to express my gratitude to the Hoover Institution for providing me with this opportunity to speak today, and to all of you who will listen to my talk. I sincerely hope that this talk will help you understand the history, the current affairs of Japan and other East Asian countries better, and to share the history and the current challenges of the Pacific with us, even when faced with the pandemic. Today's talk will focus on Japan and East Asia more than 100 years ago and the relationship among power, media, and popular culture, which rapidly changed at the time. It still raises various issues that we should consider even today beyond the national borders, particularly in light of the advancement of digitalization. In the 1890s, when the United States was expanded into the Pacific Ocean after the era of the Western frontier, the Meiji government of Japan started on the path of modernization, selectively adopting Western system and technology. The Meiji government policy ideologies were enrich the country and strengthen the armed forces. However, with the promotion of the strength the armed forces policy, the Meiji government proceeded to invade Korean Peninsula, China, and Taiwan. How did the public receive the war fever banned by the government at the time? These issues have not been clarified much until now. In today's talk, I aim to point out that this war fever was closely related to the new technology of publishing and printing, and to the new media of motion picture that were emerging at the time. Also, I will explain the role played by popular culture and entertainment, and trace how the public contributed to the rise of media nationalism. Looking at the map on the screen we hold at Kyoto University, I want to look back at some history. Since the mid-9th century, the Meiji government has been involved in war every decade. That is to say, the Meiji government invaded the Korean Peninsula and China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, invaded northeastern China or Manchuria in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, and invaded the German-held South Sea Island and Shantou Province in World War I in 1914. During these 2 decades, Japan colonized the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan, lists the territory of the Liaotung Peninsula in China and the southern Sakhalin Island. Furthermore, as part of Treaty of Versailles, after World War I, the South Sea Islands were also made part of Japanese mandated areas. As a result, pre-war Japan's land territory expanded to about 1.8 times the size of today's Japan. These 3 foreign wars, the Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, and World War I, led the Meiji government to integrate the enrich the country policy and strengthen the armed forces policy. In the end, Meiji government pursued military expansion centering around the development of the munition industry. Why did Meiji government to do so? First, because Japan was overwhelmingly poor at that time. Its industrial planning was lagging, and its technological level was inferior to that of advanced Western countries. Against this backdrop, Meiji government has suffered from the painful experience of concluding so-called unequal treaties with Western powers. The government dreamed of establishing an equal relationship with the international community by converging on 2 policies, enrich the country and strengthen the armed forces, became the greatest misfortune to Japan and the Japanese was that it proceeded with the integration of these 2 policies. Now, let us move on to the Sino-Japanese War that occurred in 1894. Let us think about the public became involved in the policy of the Meiji government. The war triggered a dispute between Japan and the Qing dynasty China over the sovereignty of the Korean Peninsula, and ultimately its position. However, as the war expanded, the war zone extended not only to the Korean Peninsula, but also to Qing China. And after the war, Taiwan was included in the Japanese territory. In Japan, the first media to report about this war was the woodblock print media called Nishikiri, which had been around since the Edo period. Since Japan was still in the early stage of national unification at the time, so it is important to stress that the government and the military were not solely responsible for cultivating the willingness to fight and rising public awareness. Also, I want to point out the role of media nationalism aroused by the private sector was extremely important. The first land and naval battle between Japan and the Qing China was fought in Pyongyang, which is now the capital of North Korea. Among several Nishikiri held at Hoover that illustrates this battle, we would like to pay attention to the Nishikiri by artist Miita Toshihide, The two sets are made up of 3 panels each and were sold on different days. But these were part of one 6-panel image. However, later our investigation revealed that this pair was accompanied by another set of Nishikiri, which was placed further to the left. So they were part of one 9-panel image. Uncommon example, as most Nishikiri at the time consists of only 3 panels. War fever was initially limited to the elites. In Japan, only the former samurai and part of intellectuals enthusiastically viewed the Sino-Japanese War as an opportunity to combat against the declining position and resulting depressive atmosphere. And pro-Westernization Chinese officials were also enamored with the war. The masses in both countries initially showed mute interest in the war. However, the development of printing techniques such as lithograph, collotype printing, halftone, and photo etching allowed the large-scale production of war Nishikiri and photographs. These products inundated the market and swallowed the masses into war fever. In Japan, Nishikiri became fashionable again as if beaming in its last moment of glory. Nishin Sensojiki, or true account of the Sino-Japanese War, featuring rising media of photographs, had record sales. Nishikiri depicting the war situation served beyond newspaper reportage, where Nishikiri painting also produced posters for new and traditional theatrical performances. Kawakami Otojiro and his troupe inaugurated a play show titled Sino-Japanese War. This new Shinpa type of melodramatic play emerges out of the Soshi or amateur theater movement and was differentiated from traditional kabuki theater. The Hoover has in its collection a Nishikiri by Utagawa Kunisada entitled Kawakami Theatrical Performance, the Sino-Japanese War, on the screen. The Kawakami's play show was a big hit because the topic was synchronized with the real war, which made Kawakami known overseas. Japanese newspapers, the Yomiuri Shimbun, reported Kawakami's sold-out performance every day. Kawakami's exceptional box office success inspired the traditional kabuki theater to feature similar war plays. As I mentioned on the screen, the Hoover's collection of Haruki's new play show, Japan's Greatest Victory, Anjo River theme, is a Nishikiri for a kabuki performance held at the Haruki's Theater in Tokyo. However, such war stories were not so big hit in the traditional kabuki world and became the specialty of the new type of performances. At any rate, Nishikiri played a decisive role in rising the war fever among the masses by punctual not only as a bulletin of the current affairs, but also a propaganda medium for popular culture. Of course, such print media and popular culture were not only ones responsible for conveying the war fever to the common people in Japan. War fever was inspired by the media and popular culture and connecting and penetrated the living space of the common people through retail stores such as toy shops, Photoshop and liquor stores, as well as playhouses, births, and various events. Meanwhile, in the Qing Dynasty China at the end of the 19th century, the printed media called Huabao Gazette became popular as an alternative visual media to Nishikiri. Among them, Shanghai Dianshijai Huabao was popular, which featured the war between the Qing Dynasty and France that occurred 10 years before the Sino-Japanese War. This print media sold well as a general magazine that provided much information not only on the war situation but also on social custom, overseas affairs, science, nature, religion, superstition, and so on. However, we can point out Huabao was media for the masses. Outlandish articles and eye-catching image caught people's attention rather than the accuracy of the articles. Yanhua lithograph also serves as war reportage. These Yanhua lithographs were originally ephemeral media displayed as protector against evil, lucky charms, or even depiction of historical hero tales. Very few what seems Yanhua lithograph have survived today. Therefore, in May 2014, Chinese were shocked to see 56 pieces of what seems Yanhua for the first time, when the British Library, in collaboration with the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, put them on online exhibit. The Sino-Japanese War Yanhua lithograph in the British Library have caught a lot of attention. From probably 2016 onward, views of these prints wrote in the Chinese social networking system that these prints convinced them of the Qing's victory over Japan and led them to revise their historical understanding. Moreover, these messages were copied over to other sites by SNS. If this type of patriotism generated by historical representation can spread today, these influences were even stronger at the end of the 19th century. Chinese lithograph significantly boosted the Chinese love for their country. Reporting facts were not their main agenda. In any case, Nishikiri, Huabao Gazette, and the Yanhua lithograph in Japan or China were all propaganda media to convey the victory of the war, not news media to convey the war fact. However, in the West, where Japanese was in vogue at the time, there was a great deal of interest in the war between Meiji Japan and the Qing Dynasty China. The Sino-French War had ended only 10 years earlier. Many correspondents were dispatched to East Asia. Among them, George Bigo was employed as a correspondent for the conservative French illustrated weekly Le Monde Illustré and the British illustrated weekly middle-class newspaper The Graphic. His realistic paintings were distinct as shown on this screen. Bigo focused his gaze on subjects not captured in documentary photography, such as the well figure of soldiers and prisoner of war away from a battle, casualty of war, and impoverished population of the war zone, taking photographs from a distance that allowed him to read the expression on the faces of the people to illustrate them. Of course, Bigo's artistic styling confirmed the claims of the graphic and did not represent the British or French public opinion, but his depiction of wartime humanism was rarely seen in the visual media of either Japan or China.
Next, let us shift the topic to the Russo-Japanese War. France, Germany, and Russia, these three countries did not agree on the Japanese right to the Liaotung Peninsula in northeastern China that Japan had occurred after the Sino-Japanese War. This conflict of interest was the distant cause of the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War 10 years later. In particular, the Russian government, which was seeking an ice-free port, was insist on having access to the port of Liuxin Port, known as Port Arthur, which was located at the southern tip of Liaotung Peninsula. The Russo-Japanese War was the conflict over hegemony in Manchuria, like an exploded ordnance of the past Sino-Japanese War 10 years earlier. It was the first example of modern warfare between Asian and European nations. Although the Qing dynasty had a sense of a crisis of war within its territory, Qing dynasty government declared itself neutral 4 days after the conflict erupted to escape the repeated disaster of the Sino-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War also characterized the important role of state diplomacy in attracting foreign funds for war expenses. True, Britain and the United States supported Japan. However, France and Germany were on the Russian side. Pictorial magazine published in those countries reflected this international relationship. For example, Le Petit Parisien and Le Petit Journal in France were critical of the Japanese army. Although only 10 years passed between the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, the media and the publishing and printing technology that supported them developed remarkably during that time. In Japan, the war seemed Nishikiri, which had been popular during the Sino-Japanese War, had become boring. And new media such as photography, postcards, and motion picture took over in popularity. It was in September 1904, during the Russo-Japanese War, that the first news photographs appeared in the main newspaper in Japan. The spread of photography led to a rapid increase in the number of graphical magazines. For example, Hoover's collection, as shown on the screen, includes the Russo-Japanese War fully illustrated, published by Tokyo Kinkodo, and the photowork of Ogawa Kazuma, one of the leading photographers of that time. Through the new media of photography, the public came to feel the war more realistically and intimately. The use of photographs did not stop with print media. As a Louisiana Purchase exposition in Central East Missouri in 1904, Meiji government constructed Japanese-style impressive houses and a beautiful garden, and displayed products from each region and 174 scene pictures of Japan. Despite being at war, Meiji government was encouraged by Ross's cancellation and participated in this exposition as part of its public diplomacy campaign. In this way, Meiji government succeeded in sparking interest in Japan and by extension in the Russo-Japanese War. As the war progressed,
the demand of postcard for family to send to soldier going off to war also increased. In the 2 years following the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese Ministry of Post and Telecommunication released many commemorative postcards. This image you see on the screen shows a typical art style and lithographic multicolor printing technique. Because of the huge number of postcard issues, the culture of postcard spread and the fever of collecting postcards commemorating war service heated up in Japan, both during and after the war. Because of this picture postcard collecting boom, the number of stores selling picture postcards increased by about 4,000, and some stores that sold Nishikiri changed their products. Also, even more than photograph and postcard, magic lanterns and newly introduced black-white motion picture were used to raise the public war spirits, especially the traveling screening of these motion pictures throughout Japan triggered the first nationwide film boom. The National Film Archive of Japan has confirmed that there are more than 18 real films related to the Russo-Japanese War in Japan, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The screen is a live-action film of the Russo-Japanese War from the Huntley Film Archive, one of the largest film libraries in Europe. Meanwhile, in Russia, producers of a traditional Russian print called Lubok, plural Lubiki, prints sold in rural market quickly responded to the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. These Lubok images worked better as visual wartime propaganda for farmers, many of whom were illiterate, than newspaper and government publicity. War-themed postcard later entered the distribution market. The chromolithography Lubok prints contrasted the righteous protagonists with their enemies. The traditional images are witty illustration over brown heroes or Russian warriors defeating foes. Therefore, Lubok prints of the early Russo-Japanese War period cartoon gigantic and mighty Cossack, marking, burying, and disrespecting the small and meek Japanese. This depiction never evoked Japanese as intimidating. At times, other nationalities standing behind Japanese soldiers were similarly illustrated as objects of mockery. Here you can see a small soldier guarding a Briton, fat and well-dressed, an uncle-looking American, and a Chinese with cool hairstyle. However, this type of media lacks the timeliness and of war reportage. As they were in Japan, postcards in Russia was another significant medium in the Russo-Japanese War. The first postcard was issued in Russia in 1895. From this point, the fever collection of postcards spread in urban areas, particularly among the intelligentsia. Postcards circulated in the form of government propaganda, company advertisement, social education, and entertainment beyond their original purpose of communication. The Russo-Japanese War-themed postcard illustrated soldiers' daily life, portrait of a war hero, in addition to land and naval battle scene, and so on. A close examination of the battle scene depicted on postcard revealed that Russian soldiers were postured heroically with vibrant facial expression, in contrast to rough-looking Japanese soldiers fleeing cowardly. Among them, the most renowned piece depicted Russian in armor, looking like an ancient epic hero fighting a Japanese samurai on this scene. This postcard reminded Russians that their country was fighting a nation with an alien culture in the Far East. Since many postcards were made from photographs, publishers tried to acquire works by photographers, among them the young photographer Viktor Karlovich Bulla was particularly celebrated both at home and abroad. The photographs on the screen is Bulla himself riding a horse from the Hoover's photographic records. His pictures from various activities were featured in Russian magazines such as Niba, Ikkupo, and many Russian newspapers and foreign publications. Nikolai Samukh was another war correspondent for Niba magazine in 1904 and depicted many scenes from pictures of experiences the difficulty of military life during the war. Samukh's picture book, published in 1905, became popular in urban areas too and have been reprinted multiple times to date. Waves of political and social unrest, known as the First Russian Revolution, started in mid-1905, and consumers quickly lost interest in the war-themed postcards and photographs. The Russo-Japanese war-themed rulebook prints did not last even 2 years in Russia. War fever quickly switched to revolutionary fever, which embroiled every rural and urban community. No Russo-Japanese war-themed postcard and photo books were sold after the posthumous peace treaty was signed on September 4, 1905. I will summarize the content of today's talk. The word Nishikiri, which was popular during the Sino-Japanese War, declined with the end of the war because of crude and random production. In Russia, rulebook print was popular in rural areas, and postcards and photo books were popular in urban areas. But with the outbreak of revolutionary movement, this type of media declined. However, in the Qin Dynasty China, explosive hit 电视在画报 triggered a rapid increase in the number of lithographic prints of this type, even after the collapse of the Qin dynasty. Nevertheless, but all these media published in countries directly involved in the war had in common was that they were all propaganda media that conveyed victory, regardless of the true war outcome. In Europe, on the other hand, the situation was a little different. The interests of various countries intersected, and the interest in the Russo-Japanese War was particularly high, and many color-printed newspapers and magazines were published. They did not proclaim victory as the Japanese, Chinese, and Russian did. Despite bias due to national interest, they included photograph and color and precise illustration of the reality of war, including the condition of soldiers on the front line and the tragedies of residents. The nation involved in the war did not show their failure of strategy, only reported victory in the media, arousing media nationalism in both the public and private sector. However, When it became clear that these victories were nothing more than illusion, the pent-up frustration and discontent of the war years exploded immediately, and riots broke out in Tokyo, Beijing, and Moscow. Such social unrest turned into dissatisfaction with the government in Russia and China, and became one of the factors that led to revolutionary movement there. In this way, history has proven that fake news will eventually be exposed and that such information will cause more damage to the authority than expected. In the regard, I want to emphasize here that the significance of studying history is one of the most important education in the chaotic era of truth and disinformation. That is all for my speech. Thank you very much for your attention. ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Professor Kishi, for your inspiring and thought-provoking talk. We have received many interesting and engaging questions. We'll try to answer as many as the time allows. If you, some of you seem to be having an image quality issue, we'll make sure to upload the highest quality video to the website. So please stay tuned on that. So Professor Kishi, the war Japan was engaging, that is the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95, caught international attention for the first time. The first question is, what role or roles did foreign journalists like George Bigo play in war journalism in Japan and around the world?
It is a critical point from mid-9th century onward. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the two Opium Wars in Qing China increased European interest in Asia. In particular, the popular media in East Asia focused on the Sino-French War of 1884. However, in the later half of the 19th century, Europeans' understanding of Asia was still to an early stage. It was still a fascination with exotic Asian culture. The international exposition in Paris, Vienna, and Chicago brought Japanism into vogue. As a result, with the publication in 1894 of the world's first illustrated newspaper, Illustrated London News, and some other visual media, information about the world, of course, including Asia, became rapidly visualization for the people in Europe. Thus, and the Europeans' interest in Asia increased. Newspaper and magazine sent many correspondents to Asia. The visual information they conveyed enabled the European public to visualize world in Asia. So such war visual journalists like Bigo, it is safe to say that a curiosity about that has existed since the 7th century turned into a better understanding of the reality of Asian life.
Great. That's really fascinating. So war journalism, in a way, contributed turning Western curiosity for exotic Asia into something closer to Asia's realities. Now I'd like to bring the discussion to the Japanese domestic market. Nishikiri, or multicolored woodblock prints, did something text-based newspaper articles could not do. They really captured the moment of action and dramatized battle scenes. These prints were affordable to ordinary customers, right? And similarly, although we can no longer see the actual performances, we know Kawakami Otojiro's theatrical plays of First Sino-Japanese War were blockbuster. So could you tell us a little bit more about these activities? And the question is, how did these dynamic illustrations of Nishikiri and theatrical plays affect Japanese consumers?
Well, the activity of Kawakami Otojiro, as I have already mentioned, are extremely symbolic. After his simple play, the Sino-Japanese War became a big hit.
Kawakami traveled to Korean Peninsula during the Sino-Japanese War to gather more materials for his new play. He brought over a ton of photographic equipment with him and visited various battle sites in Korea. Moreover, he brought back the clothing, swords, banners, caps, and other military items left behind by the Qing army. After returning to Japan, Kawakami used these war remnants to create a new show that was also a big hit. Since there were still no movies or television, audience simulated the reality of war by watching the play of Kawakami troops. As a result, the fame of Kawakami troop grew even bigger. It is said that even the crown prince, who heard the rumor of his play, requested a special performance by his troop. Additionally, the Ezoshia, which dealt with the self of Nishikiri, made Nishikiri print of not only war reports but also the activity of the Kawakami troop and sold them in large quantity. And consumer bought them one after another. In this way, the war people, aroused by the combination of Nishikiri and popular culture, such as theatrical performances, encourage consumers to buy war-related dairy products such as food, drinks, and so on.
Great. So like Japanese consumers are really exposed to war-related information in many ways, from book prints to theater performances and even daily products. Yeah, so I'd like to now move on to Manchuria. We have a question from Paul Gregory from the Hoover Institution. He and Restover have been researching on Mikhail Grigoriev, and Grigoriev edited Eastern Review, which was the voice of Japanese imperial policy funded by Mantetsu, or South Manchurian Railway Company. It was created as a direct result of the Russo-Japanese War and served as the policy company of the Empire of Japan. The journal aimed at Japan's Russian immigrant population, and the post was highly sensitive because of Japanese fear of war with the USSR, he wrote. He'd like to know what kind of synergies there were for these non-Japanese language publications in Manchuria.
Thank you, Dr. Gregory. Although not from today's talk, when considering wartime Japanese propaganda media, I agree that the role of Manchurian medium is critical for understanding Japanese propaganda. So far, the focus has been on propaganda media in Japanese. But recent new research shows a new promising trend focusing on the other ethnic medium in Manchuria. For example, English or Russian media was created for Russian immigrants in Manchuria, besides Korean newspaper, Arabic Tatar newspaper, and Mongolian newspapers. But Mantetsu often targeted foreign readership. Its Paris branch, which later moved to Berlin, and New York branch published the print media in French and English. We need to conduct more research on Mantetsu's propaganda policy and their impact on the local community and international relationship. Moreover, I think after World War II, many community magazines were put out outside Manchuria by people who once lived in Manchuria, such as the Jewish magazine published in Israel, written in Russia, possessed in the University of Hawaii at Manual Library. We also should pay attention to the post-war medium. Anyway, we need to consider Japan's propaganda strategy to reach out to international public opinion while examining propaganda media besides in Japanese and Chinese. That is all.
So it sounds like in the future, we might be able to better understand this really complex network of different ethnic groups who lived in Manchuria. Now we move on to the next question from Jennifer Westfield of Duke University. She's asking, how does advertising design intersect with wartime propaganda?
Thank you, Professor Weissenfeld. Recent studies of Japanese iconography have demonstrated that Japanese commercial advertising was designed to concerning the propaganda media used in Europe during World War I. For example, the design concept of Louis Oppenheimer's 1918 poster calling for the purchase of German government bonds was used in the newspaper advertisement design of Japanese Garbage Collection Association in 1941. Also, part of the design of the political poster by Victor Arnold, 1919 Germany, was used for advertisement for a light thermometer in Osaka in 1922. Although these examples are not rare cases, the reuse or exploitation of European design in Japan was not limited to commercial activities. During World War II, many political propaganda media created by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs Information Department also used German, the United States, the Soviet Union propaganda poster from the World War I era. We can see this example in the University of Tokyo's web archive.
Great. Might have a little bit time for one more question. So we witnessed changes of print technologies and rapid emergence of photographs literally in one decade, from the First Sino-Japanese War to the Russo-Japanese War. And back then, as we know, that taking pictures required large equipment, and you really couldn't take pictures of soldiers and battleships in action. They were all still objects. How the Japanese consumers, as you mentioned, who were so enjoying colorful and dynamic Nishikiri, actually transitioned to more actionless black and white photography. The question is, how was their reaction like, and how did they actually make this transition?
In this regard, it will be good to talk about my personal experience. I belong to the Japanese television generation, to the one that was mesmerized by the magic black and white television as it spread into our home in the 1960s. Color television became popular in 1968. In my boyhood, I remember the news event of the Apollo 11 moon landing in July 1969, and I watched in color television. However, at that time, we had already read multicolored comic magazine at our home and watched the color animation at the movie theater. So the colorization of TV program did not make much of an impression on me or as a friend. Rather, I think it was the advent of photography and film as a medium to capture real life situations that excited people beyond national borders. It has been amazing to see people who are neither rich nor famous being photographed, much less participating in the war in a foreign land in real time. Therefore, by the time of World War I, the dealer with Nishikiri picture postcard were already in decline. At the time, people began to frequently movie theater in Japan. At that time, the movie theater, which were in their infancy as entertainment facilities.
Great. Thank you, Professor Kishi. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before closing?
Thanks, Kay. I received many other questions, but due to time constraints, I apologize to skip them. One thing to keep in mind is that what I have described in today's talk is from the perspective of information visualization. According to recent research on soundscapes, these changes in visualization were not necessarily linked to change in the auditorium medium. It was not until the advent of talkie film in the 1930s that sound and image became linked around the world. And during World War II, talkie film, along with radio broadcasting, became mainstream propaganda media to promote the mobilization of the people. I believe that from a technological research standpoint or method, research on auditorium media should be carried out in parallel with research on visual media. Finally, I sincerely appreciate Dr. Ueda and all the Hoover people who have helped me in various ways. Once the pandemic is under control, I sincerely hope to meet you all at Hoover. Thank you very much for everyone. ありがとう。
Thank you again, Professor Kishi. We hope to see you at Hoover in the near future. The higher quality video will be posted on the website, and then also the online exhibit, including the map of Port Arthur, will become available to the public in the fall. So please stay tuned. And now back to Eric.
Thank you, Dr. Ueda. Thank you, Professor Kishi, for excellent talk. Thank you so much. I just want to thank everyone for attending, and to let you know that we have dates for upcoming talks. Just want to give you a little heads up on what's coming in this series. Professor Yuma Totani of University of Hawaii will speak on anti-Japanese US propaganda leaflets in the Hoover collections. Professor Alice Seng at Boston, who will speak on the Meiji Emperor and his role in Japanese modernity and nation building. And Sherilyn Orbach, Professor of Asian Studies at University of British Columbia, who will speak on World War II Kamishibai, which are paper plays, as we've talked about, performed by narrators. I want to thank everyone for attending, and again, a warm round of virtual applause for Professor Kishi for his talk today. Thank you so much.